5 blind boys of Mississippi, singing Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. I'm Sam Biagetti, and this is Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. This is the first lecture of this podcast series, and to introduce myself, I am a historian with a PhD in early American history, and I have taught classes at Columbia University and Barnard College. Right now, I am just living in New England, where I'm also an antique dealer on the side. And I'm starting this podcast, Historiansplaining, in order to respond to the kinds of questions that I often get, not only from students, but from friends and family, about aspects of history that they're confused about or suspicious about, and that they want clarified. This is going to be a big picture kind of podcast, and I'm going to try to give you the kind of historical rigor and quality that you should get from a real serious academic lecture, but talk like a human being, which is always what I try to do in my classes. So I'm going to focus particularly on historical myths, peeling away myths that distort or falsify the past. And probably you've seen there are a lot of podcasts and blogs that talk about historical myths, and they tend to be about sort of neat little anecdotes, things you might have been told wrong in 5th grade. George Washington didn't really have wooden teeth. And that's true. George Washington didn't really have wooden teeth. And there are all kinds of, little myths and misconceptions like that you could spend, all day and all night clearing up and making clickbait about. And I'm not going to get too deeply into those. They may come up once in a while, but I'm going to try to tackle the big myths. The myths that really structure how we think about the entire past and how we ended up where we are now today. Okay? Myths fundamentally are stories that try to justify and rationalize and explain why the world looks the way it does today. And myths might be sometimes true. They're not necessarily false. They can be true or false. But they're very dangerous and pernicious when they're false, because false myths or partly false myths not only distort what's happened in the past, but they distort what's going on today, right? Because they give you a false sense of why things are the way they are now. So when I try to peel away these myths, I have an agenda, right? I'm trying to change the way we think about how the world works and how we ended up in this modern world that we see around us today. And I think that it's probably an appropriate time to do this because right now, in 2017, as I'm speaking, we are in a time of a lot of doubt and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of anxiety about whether the sort of social order, world order that we've gotten to know is really working and how it's going to work in the future. So my first several lectures are going to deal with what I think of as the biggest myth of all, the biggest shaping myth that really structures the way we teach history, the way we write and talk about history all the time in ways we don't even think of. And that's the myth of the Middle Ages, right? The Middle Ages are the linchpin of how at least Western people talk about our history and where we came from, right? If you believe there's such a thing as the Middle Ages, then that fits nicely into a simple 3-part story of history, right? All great stories should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So the Middle Ages conveniently serve that purpose as the middle part of the story. And what are the 3 parts? You probably can recite them right now. Ancient, medieval, modern, right? And medieval, of course, just comes from the Latin words meaning middle age or middle era. So you've got the ancient, the medieval, and the modern, right? And it's a very nice, neat, convenient story. You've got all these wonderful, splendorous things, all this art and philosophy in the ancient world. Then, of course, the Middle Ages are the Dark Ages. They're the age of ignorance and barbarity and so forth. But then we get the modern age, where we wonderful moderns get to revive everything that was good in the ancient world. It's a very nice, convenient story. It wraps up very nicely, but it's a myth, and that's not to say that it's entirely false or that nothing about it is true, but it's a really arbitrary way of structuring history that creates a lot of notions and a lot of assumptions that don't really hold up. So when we talk today about the Middle Ages or use the word medieval, we tend to be talking about something horrible, right? Something we reject, something that disgusts us. We talk about war or genocide, and we say these are medieval barbarities. Or we talk about ignorance and suppression of knowledge, and we call it medieval. And it's a very neat and easy way to project everything we might not like about ourselves or about our own world and dissociate ourselves from those things and distance them and say, no, they belong to that other age. They're not really ours. There's a scene in the movie All About Eve, which is a movie from 1950, where a stage actress meets with a theater critic in her hotel room. And the theater critic speaks to her threateningly. And he tells her, after tonight, after you give your opening performance tonight, you will belong to me. And the actress, of course, is disgusted and taken aback, and she says, belong to you? It sounds medieval, like something out of an old melodrama. And the theater critic, Addison, says, so does the history of the world for the last 20 years. So this exchange, encapsulates so much. So firstly, the actress, Eve, is taking something that sounds wrong to her, that it sounds unequal, it sounds unfair, and she pushes it away by saying that belongs to that other era, the Middle Ages, that age of brutality and darkness. And when the theater critic responds, he says, so does the history of the world for the last 20 years. And this movie is from 1950. So when he says that, he's talking about the Depression and World War II. And he's saying those things are somehow medieval. Of course, worldwide financial collapse, depression, mass air warfare, genocide, nuclear warfare, these are all very modern things. These are all products of modern technology, modern economics, modern institutions, and they were very new when they were witnessed in the 1930s and 40s. And yet, because they have this sort of air of brutality and chaos, irrationality about them, people can push them away and say, no, they're not really ours. They're not really of the modern era. They're somehow medieval. And I think this is just a beautiful, typical instance of how people use the myth of the Middle Ages to manage what they think and what they feel about their own lives and their own world, right? So this is the sort of convenient role that the Middle Ages still play for us today in our imagination, in our way of understanding the world. Now, to try to get more precise, historians do still use this term, the Middle Ages, and it's built into everything historians do, right? You go into a history department office and you look at the list of faculty, and you'll see, Carl Wennerland, historian of modern history, Barbara Tannenbaum, historian of medieval history. Okay, Mark von Demirop, historian of ancient history. We divide up our faculties, we divide up books, magazines, all of these things into ancient, medieval, modern. So this tripartite story of history really practically defines history in the modern Western sense. Okay, there's no escaping it. And historians customarily, there's no really good shared definition of exactly what the Middle Ages are or what period we're talking about. It's a designation that really only applies to the Latin West, right? So it only applies to Central and Western Europe. It really makes no sense anywhere in the rest of the world. And it has very unclear boundaries. So basically, people tend to use Middle Ages to mean the entire era from the fall of the Roman Empire, which happened more or less in the 400s AD, up until the Renaissance, which happened in the 14 and 1500s. So if you want to put nice, neat numbers on it, you can say it's basically the era from 500 to 1500, that age of about 1,000 years. Okay, so 1,000-year period. Why do we group that entire age together under one label? It's very unclear. There were enormous changes, exploration, inventions, political changes that happened within that age. And of course, there were also major continuities in how society worked, in law, in customs, in art, that continued through the fall of the Western Roman Empire and that continued through from the late Middle Ages into the modern era. So it's pretty arbitrary why we snip out that block of time from about 500 to 1500. And there's not very much that you can point to that really unifies that era. But if I, for my own purposes, had to say, okay, what is it that distinguishes the Middle Ages, that makes it a distinct era from the rest, from what came before and what came after? A nice way to put a fine point on it is simply to say that it began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Okay, and I very specifically say Western Roman Empire. That's because the Roman Empire as such didn't fall. Okay, that is a myth right there that we have to dispel. The Roman Empire didn't fall in the 400s and 500s AD at the beginning of the Middle Ages. Only the Western Empire fell, but the Eastern Empire persisted just fine. Okay, so the empire had already been administratively divided into eastern and western zones, and Constantine had established an eastern capital at Constantinople, what's today Istanbul. And the eastern part of the empire continued to march on through the centuries and functioned perfectly well. It's only the Western Empire that gradually fell apart. And it was not a cataclysmic fall. You know, it wasn't a bunch of barbarians riding in and whopping everyone on the head, and that was the end of it. It was a gradual breakdown in institutions and organization that over time led to the Western Empire dissolving. While the Eastern Empire persisted until it was eventually conquered by the Ottoman Turks in the 1400s, so about 1,000 years after. So you can roughly say the Middle Ages are basically the period of time when the Eastern Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, continued to rule and function in the East, but the Western Empire had fallen apart. So it was an age when Western Europe, or Western and Central Europe, where Latin was the main language of learning and diplomacy, it was an age when that area was very fragmented, decentralized, disorganized, and very weak and poor and isolated as compared to the Eastern Mediterranean and, of course, the Islamic Middle East and Asia, where the really strong, vibrant civilizations were. So it was an era when Western Europe was really overshadowed by greater societies to the east. And but past that, I'm not going to put down the Latin West any more than that, because as you'll see, the picture is not as bleak as the myth of the Middle Ages would have us believe. So that more or less is the era we're talking about. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read off to you some basic associations, notions, images that come to people's minds when they hear about the Middle Ages, and that sort of structure how we think of the Middle Ages. And then I'm going to review how much of those perceptions and notions are accurate. Okay? And then I'm going to talk about, lastly, I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about why do we separate history into these three eras? Where did that notion come from, right? So as some scholars would say, I'm going to deconstruct the idea of the Middle Ages. But once I've done that, then in later lectures, I'm going to then talk about how did society really work? How did law work? How did art and culture work? Religion, everyday life in this era, so that we can then start to build a more accurate picture of what the Middle Ages really were. So let me go through. These are some things that students have said, and that also friends, family, acquaintances have presented to me when I ask them, what do you think of when you think of the Middle Ages or the medieval world? So more or less, people think of the Middle Ages as violent, ignorant, intolerant, and intolerable. And I'll explain more what those specific associations are. Okay, it was a violent world. There was a lot of raping and pillaging. There were horrific public executions, extensive use of torture. And this sort of violent character and violent impulses of the Middle Ages see their expression most of all in the Crusades, right? A series of wars and invasions of the Middle East that were motivated by religious hatred and greed, and that involved deception and exploitation of ordinary people who were deceived into taking part in the Crusades. The Middle Ages were ignorant. There was little or no science. Medicine was poor and involved counterproductive practices like bloodletting. There was a great deal of superstition, belief in magic and witchcraft. People believed that the earth is flat and other ridiculous primitive notions like that. And scientists who tried to counter the superstitions and dogmas of the age were often persecuted. And in more generally speaking, knowledge was controlled and suppressed by the church. And for this reason, a great deal of ancient knowledge, of that fund of knowledge from the ancient Greco-Roman world, was lost, and many books of invaluable knowledge were destroyed in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages were intolerant. The church had almost complete power over society, as illustrated in the Inquisition and in the practice of witch hunting, which killed many innocent people, particularly women. It was an age of hatred towards Jews and Muslims, which was illustrated in the Crusades and also in more everyday persecution. It was also an age of suppression towards women and towards homosexuality. Okay, so it would have been a very bad time for women and gays. And finally, the Middle Ages were intolerable, so they were an unpleasant era. They were racked by disease. The medievals had poor hygiene. They smelled bad and didn't wash. Okay, this is a great one because this is one that some people have actually pointed to as their foremost impression that comes to mind most quickly and most strongly about the Middle Ages, that people smelled bad and didn't wash. Okay, the food was bad. It was tasteless and rotten. There was a great demand for spices in the Middle Ages because people's meat was rotten and they needed spices to mask the bad tastes and odors. It was an era of severe inequality and oppression. The political system was feudalism, in which people were subordinated to their social superiors, ultimately the king or queen who had absolute power. And most people were subject to serfdom. So they had no rights or freedoms. They could not move around. They were tied to the land and forced to work. This involved constant backbreaking labor. People had short lifespans with a life expectancy only around 35. It was finally a boring era, devoid of great art, music, theater, and such art as there was dull, uncreative, and tradition-bound, and basically uninteresting. And it was a sexually prudish era. Because it was fervently religious, it was sexually prudish. And all in all, it was a painful era to live in, physically and emotionally. And I think this image of the Middle Ages is summed up in certain depictions that we think of in popular culture, like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. The sort of ridiculous superstitions, tell me again how sheep's bladder may be employed to prevent earthquake. And everyone's covered in dirt and have no teeth and, are groveling in mud. This is the basic atmosphere of the Middle Ages that we tend to think of. Okay. Basically, we can see the Middle Ages are the kind of blank slate on which we can project everything we don't want to be, right? Technologically primitive, superstitious, intolerant. Everything that we like to think we aren't, we ascribe those things to the Middle Ages. And hence, the Middle Ages literally become in our minds, although this term isn't used as much anymore, they literally become in our minds the Dark Ages, right? The sort of night in contrast to our day, the daytime, the light, the enlightenment of the modern world. Okay. Is any of this true? Some of these things are at least partly true. Some of them are true only of certain periods or certain places in the Middle Ages. Some of them are true of the Middle Ages, but are also equally true of all of history before and after the Middle Ages, or of other ages of history. And some of them are just false. Okay. There was a good deal of pillaging in medieval warfare. A lot of medieval, especially in the early Middle Ages, a lot of medieval war involved destroying your opponent's crops and land and villages. So there was a lot of war, and it was a violent era. But if we look at the grand sweep of all of human history, the basic trend tends to be that in each that violent death among humankind has been very slowly diminishing, right? We've been getting less and less violent very, very gradually over time, with a lot of ups and downs. And so it's reasonable to suppose we can't really tell in detail exactly how violent the Middle Ages were, because we don't have complete records. But it seems reasonable to estimate that probably the Middle Ages were slightly less violent than the ancient world that preceded them, and slightly more violent than the modern world we live in now. But it's really hard to put any stock in that generalization. It's almost impossible to compare. We don't have enough information. We don't have enough data. And there, of course, have been massive outbreaks of horrible violence in the modern world. The world wars, genocides, and probably the biggest war ever in known history, the Taiping Rebellion in China, which we never talk about, probably killed a bit more people than World War II. And altogether, it's hard to extrapolate generalizations about the modern world when we have only 500 years to look at. And in the scale of human history, that's really a very short period. And it's hard to know, are terrible outbreaks of violence like World War II or the Taiping Rebellion typical? Or are they unusual? Are they aberrations? And how do you then compare that to the 1,000 years of the Middle Ages? So basically, there certainly was war, there certainly was violence in the Middle Ages. Does that mean it was more violent of an era? Was it more violent than what came before or what came after? Probably not really. There were public executions, as there have been frequently in the modern world as well. And in fact, the great heyday of public executions in Europe, at least, was really the 1700s. Public hangings were happening at practically a breakneck pace, pun not intended, in France and Britain in the 1700s, and that ultimately culminated in the guillotine and the Reign of Terror. So public executions are not something special to the Middle Ages. Neither is torture. Okay, torture is still common today. Our own government practices it, although they use euphemisms for it. So torture is not particularly a distinguishing feature of the Middle Ages. And then there are the Crusades. People think of the Crusades. Now, the Crusades are very important. They were very significant, transformative events for Europe and for medieval society. I'm going to talk about the Crusades in later lectures, but it's important to pin down a few basic facts about the Crusades. There's a lot of discussion today about what motivated the Crusades and how horrible were they. They were wars. They involved a lot of destruction, a lot of death. There were massacres perpetrated by crusaders. Were they motivated by religious hatred? Not so much. There isn't really evidence of that. It seems more that they actually were motivated by a desire to control Jerusalem and the pilgrimage routes to Jerusalem. So they really had Christian religious motivations. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So the reasons for the Crusades were basically, it seems, the reasons that people stated at the time. And they were not motivated by greed. Okay, that is completely unsupportable by the facts. Palestine and the city of Jerusalem were fairly poor. You had very little chance of getting rich by going on crusade. There was not much wealth there to be had. You were far more likely to die going on crusade than you were to get any significant amount of loot or to come back to Europe with any sort of wealth. And everyone knew it, but they kept going on crusade anyway for social and political and religious reasons. So they were not in... the notion that they were motivated by greed simply does not hold up at all under examination. But there are complicated social and political factors that led to the Crusades happening when they did. And we'll talk about that later. The Crusades are a fascinating subject, and I'll get into those much more. Okay, was it an ignorant era? Was there little or no science? Well, certainly there wasn't science in the modern sense. There weren't peer-reviewed journals. There weren't scientific faculties. There weren't randomized controlled studies. There weren't replicatable experiments in the Middle Ages. But there was a great interest in understanding nature, and often understanding nature through examination, experimentation. A lot of the research and experimentation was into optics and mechanics and other practical fields. A lot of it took place in the monasteries and priories and schools of medieval Europe, led by monks or priests. There was something of an industrial revolution in the High Middle Ages. So basically in the 1200s, there was a great movement of advancement in all kinds of practical inventions, mills, water mills, windmills, eyeglasses were invented In the High Middle Ages, mechanical clocks, and also medievals adopted and improved upon a lot of important technologies from outside of Europe that came in from Asia. Things like compasses, gunpowder, printing. So really the High and Late Middle Ages were a time of great technological advancement. People did not believe ridiculous notions like the earth is flat. Okay, that's a lie. Everyone in the Middle Ages knew that the earth was round. That had been preserved, that had been discovered and demonstrated by ancient Greek mathematicians, and that knowledge was preserved and passed on and used in the Middle Ages. People didn't think the earth was flat. And certainly there was what we would call superstition, right? Belief in unseen powers, basically just belief in things that we don't believe in anymore, which we now label as superstition. But, basically all eras of history, almost by definition, all past eras have believed in things that we don't believe in anymore, right? Knowledge and belief change and develop. There was not so much belief in magic and witchcraft as would come later, and I'll talk about that more. Really, the modern era saw the peak of belief in witchcraft, as well as alchemy, astrology. All of those ideas really flourished more in the 15 and 1600s than in the Middle Ages. Now, probably all of you at some point have heard the assertion that in the Middle Ages, the church suppressed knowledge, right? Okay, so the Latin Western Church was the one unifying, overarching social institution that spanned throughout Western Europe. That was it. There was really nothing else. And it's true that a lot of knowledge from the ancient world was lost during the Middle Ages, so it seems natural to basically blame the church and say, oh, the church must have been superstitious, obscurantist, and hated this ancient knowledge, and so controlled it and suppressed it. Okay, this is not true. This is absolutely false. The church did its level best to preserve and pass on ancient knowledge, classic philosophy, natural science, geography. It did its level best to preserve and pass on this knowledge, but it was a very difficult job. Okay, there was no paper in the early Middle Ages. Paper only came in later, and there was no printing press until the 1400s. So all knowledge had to be put down on parchment. Parchment was very expensive and difficult to produce, and it didn't last forever. After being used for a couple hundred years, parchment, just like paper, will fall apart. And even if you're not using it and it doesn't fall apart, it's very liable at some point to burn up in a fire or get destroyed in a flood or get stolen or pillaged in a war. So over time, books and documents were lost. Okay, this is the natural effect of time. And it's always been a problem. It's always been a difficulty throughout history. So during the Middle Ages, the church poured a tremendous amount of resources and labor into laboriously copying over ancient books and manuscripts, and also adding to them new philosophy, new histories, new theology were written and copied hundreds or thousands of times over during the Middle Ages, which was highly skilled, highly labor-intensive work. But the mainly monks and in the church, and also nuns and others, really devoted hundreds of thousands, millions of man-hours to trying to preserve that fund of knowledge. And some of it did manage to survive down to the modern era, but a lot of it also was lost. So that's something I'll talk about more later as well. Okay, the Middle Ages were intolerant. One of the first words that comes to a lot of people's lips when I ask them about the Middle Ages is Inquisition. Okay. Inquisition is a system of investigating crimes which goes back to Roman law. It comes out of Roman law, and it was used in the Middle Ages sometimes by the church specifically to investigate and punish the crime of heresy. So that's the crime of distorting or corrupting church teachings by baptized Christians. So this legal form was sometimes used in the Middle Ages, but not very frequently. It was not really a major part of medieval society. The Spanish Inquisition was the first really extensive, highly organized Inquisition that really sought to permanently monitor and control people's thoughts and words, and tried to permanently stamp out heresy in a given society. So the Spanish Inquisition is the big Inquisition, the one that Torquemada and the torture chambers, the one that we think of when we say Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was not a medieval institution. It was an early modern institution. Okay, it was started in the 1480s, and it continued as a permanent institution in Spanish society through the 15, 16, and 1700s. Same with the Portuguese Inquisition. It was an institution in the 15, 16, and 1700s. So in other words, the Inquisition is early modern. It's not medieval. Okay? Same with witch hunting. Okay? The effort to root out and punish and execute witches, this was not part of the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the church and royal authorities were consistent and clear. Witches don't exist. Okay? They labeled the idea of witchcraft as a superstition, and they strongly discouraged and usually forbade their subjects from hunting witches. It was considered a crime to hunt witches because witches don't really exist. Some people may have some sort of magical powers or sorcery, but they are not diabolical, and they do not have the kind of extensive, dangerous powers that paranoid people think. The era of the witch hunt in Europe was the same time period as the Spanish Inquisition. It was from the late 1400s through the 15 and 1600s, and gradually died out in the 1700s. In other words, the era of witch hunting was the Renaissance, not the Middle Ages. Okay? And these are very important points. The Spanish Inquisition and the witch hunting era are modern. They're during the era of the Renaissance and Reformation. They are not medieval. And this is, I think, a very important indication that you should see right off that all is not as it seems, right? The modern things that we like, the things we tend to celebrate about ourselves, our science and technology, our rationalism, our tolerance of minorities, our sense of equality and democracy, these things don't all go together. They do not march forward together. They are separate, and they often work against each other, okay? The era of the Renaissance was an era of great philosophical and scientific flowering. It was an era of exploration, and it was also an era of extreme repression and persecution, right? Repression of heresies, repression of supposed witchcraft. It was also an era of superstition, when people took these ideas like witchcraft very seriously, okay? And when we look back at the Middle Ages, we can't simply say all these bad things that we disapprove of, ignorance, suppression of knowledge, intolerance, that those things belong to the Middle Ages, okay? The story is much, much more complicated than that. And that's what, I'll get into more, and what I'm hoping to illustrate. Okay. There was extensive persecution of Jews and Muslims. Islam was usually illegal in most Western Christian states throughout the Middle Ages, although there were some, such as in Spain, certain kingdoms in Spain, that did allow Jews and Muslims to coexist and to practice their religions. Jews lived in many places all around Europe in the Middle Ages, and there was periodic persecution, violence, and expulsion of Jews, but those happened almost entirely in the High and Late Middle Ages. There was much less anti-Semitism in the early Middle Ages, the era that we sometimes call the Dark Ages. That's actually when peaceful coexistence and tolerance of Jews was the most common. And it's later, in the later Middle Ages, that anti-Semitism becomes more intense and violence against Jews becomes common. So this is one of the characterizations of the Middle Ages that in some ways is partly true, but more of particular periods and particular places, not really in general. The Middle Ages saw suppression of women and homosexuality. Again, this is somewhat true, but it's actually less true of the Middle Ages than it is of the early modern era. In the Middle Ages, the genders certainly were not equal. There was sexism, there were different social roles and stations assigned to men and women. But at the same time, in the Middle Ages, social class and birth were extremely important, and they often could trump gender. So a woman who was of high birth, who was the head of a noble family, or who inherited a royal or imperial throne, as sometimes happened, could gain very extensive power. Women also, even commoner women, usually could control some of their own property. They could act for themselves legally. And these sorts of rights and prerogatives tended to be taken away, again, in the 15, 16, 1700s. So some historians, although this is very controversial and it's hard to generalize across the board, some historians have actually argued that the 19th century was the real low point for women in the Western world, and that in many ways women had more freedom and more status in the Middle Ages than they did in the era from the 1500s up all the way through the 1800s. So again, women were not treated equally. There was gender oppression, but it can be easily exaggerated. There also was persecution of homosexuality, but interestingly, the persecution of homosexuality seems to be in a lot of ways concurrent with the persecution of Jews, in the sense that people seem to not pay much attention to it in the early Middle Ages, but as Europe enters an era of greater prosperity and cultural flourishing in the high and late Middle Ages, then you see more severe draconian laws punishing and suppressing homosexuality, and you start to see even executions for homosexuality. Or as they wouldn't have called it homosexuality, but rather they would have grouped sex between men or between women under the larger heading of sodomy. And sodomy simply was the general word meaning any sort of unacceptable or taboo sex. And concern about sodomy and severe punishments of sodomy increase in the later Middle Ages and again in the early modern era. Okay, the hangings of people who engaged in homosexual sex, the hangings of people who ran taverns or bars that catered to homosexuals, those happened in the 1700s. Okay, and so severe repression of homosexuality is actually more glaring and more violent in the early modern era than it is in the Middle Ages. Okay. Were the Middle Ages intolerable in the sense of unpleasant or hellish? Certainly there was disease, much more than we would be used to in a modern Western country today. And you could die of any number of diseases, smallpox, malaria, at practically any time, anywhere in Europe. And these diseases did break out periodically all around Europe. However, again, crowd diseases feed on crowds, right? They feed on large concentrations of people, particularly large cities. And the Middle Ages didn't have a lot of large cities. Rather, the modern era has more large cities, and hence the modern era has seen more severe outbreaks of deadly disease than the Middle Ages did. It's not because they had better hygiene or medicine in the Middle Ages, but it's because of just how concentrated the population is. Now, you might be saying, wait a second, what about bubonic plague? and the Black Death. Well, certainly the outbreak of bubonic plague in the 1300s was devastating. However, that started in 1347, so we're already talking about we're more than 3/4 through the Middle Ages. It's something that happened fairly late in the Middle Ages, and outbreaks of plague continued frequently up through the modern era. Okay, the worst outbreak of plague that ever happened, for example, in London, actually was in 1666, and it was called, in 1665, and it was called the Great Visitation. So it was really in the modern era, when you have these growing, crowded, unsanitary cities, that plague really became just as deadly again as it had been back in the 1300s. So plague is just as much a modern problem as it is medieval, and yet again we associate it in our minds with the Middle Ages. Did they have poor hygiene, and did they smell bad? They bathed. Okay, people in the Middle Ages bathed. There was a very extensive soap industry. Every town had soap producers. People bathed and cleaned themselves with soap fairly frequently. There also were bathhouses in cities and large towns, and bathing was very common. Even if you were in a small town dwelling where you couldn't bathe at home, you could go to public baths or commercial baths. So the notion that they smelled bad is a complete fabrication. They didn't smell any worse than modern people. And yet, I think that this myth has persisted largely because how important the sense of smell is. Our sense of disgust towards things we dislike, things that are taboo, things that we want to stay away from, we associate with bad smells. And so this has really lodged itself, I think, very deeply in people's minds, the idea that medievals smelled bad. And that's very revealing. Their food was perfectly good. They had a cuisine that used herbs and spices and sophisticated cooking techniques, just like today. They didn't have dull food. And in fact, the notion that they wanted spices from the East because their meat was rotten, this is a really good one, because really the medievals' food was fresher than ours. Okay, this was an overwhelmingly rural agrarian society. People were eating meat from animals that they slaughtered themselves, often at home. They were eating vegetables and fruits and herbs that they grew at home. Okay, it was fresh. It was more fresh than what we eat today. Okay, so this is a great, crazy upside down myth that their food was somehow rotten or bad. In fact, it's probably the opposite is true, not only in that their food was more fresh, but also in the era of the Renaissance, so in the beginning of the modern era, it became customary to breed plants to have bigger, more dramatic blooms. So you would hybridize plants to look visually more attractive. But when you do so, you tend to lose much of the scent, right? So that means that medieval herbs and flowers like lavender or sage or other herbs actually had a stronger smell and were more fragrant and more flavorful than the ones that we are accustomed to today. And there are stories, for instance, of medieval monks who said that they could always tell what the cook in the monastery was cooking that day because they could smell the herbs he was picking in the garden, and they had that strong an odor. So probably medieval food, although they didn't have certain ingredients like tomatoes or maize that came from the New World, they had a smaller set of ingredients to use. They probably made better food than what we are used to eating today. Okay. It was an age of severe inequality and oppression. Well, it's hard to argue with that. It certainly was a very unequal world. It was a world where people were divided into different classes by birth, and where it was very rare to move between those classes. It was not a world of social mobility in general for almost all people. And you've probably heard this term feudalism, that this was an age of feudalism. Okay, well, feudalism is a word that is now very controversial among scholars because it's very hard to pin down any clear definition of exactly what it means. And if you do come down to a clear definition, you tend to find that it never actually happened. Okay, so the term feudalism was not used in the Middle Ages. It was invented in the 15 and 1600s by French lawyers and jurists who had a political agenda. They were trying to justify the authority of the king and bolster his right to control land in France. And they basically invented this notion that, well, back in the early Middle Ages, the king controlled everything. He controlled the land, but then he would grant pieces of land to his vassals in return for their military service. So you may have heard this in school, this idea, okay, so you have a monarch, he allows nobles to control a piece of land if the nobles swear fealty and give him military service. Okay, this never really happened. Okay, there's no record of any such exchange happening. Rather, you owed military service to the king because he was the king. Okay, and as for holding a piece of land in fief, that's the term they used, F-I-E-F. Nobles had fiefs all the time. It's just a certain form of property holding. It's not the result of any sort of bargain or exchange with the king. So that idea of feudalism is a false myth. Okay, if you reject that, you can then try to adjust or change the meaning of feudalism to mean something else, or to mean something more broad, to mean, agrarian society or a society of unequal classes. But all of these definitions are so broad that you can speak of practically any society as feudal. If you say, well, feudalism means there are landlords who control the land and then peasants have to pay them rent, well, that's the way property works in New York City today. Landlords own the buildings, sometimes whole blocks, and the tenants have to pay rent to the landlords. It's the same system. So, if you say medieval France was feudal, then you have to say that modern New York City is feudal. So basically what you find is when you examine this word feudalism and try to pin down what it means, it always breaks down. So a lot of scholars now today simply reject it and say it's not a useful word. It's not describing anything that really happened in the Middle Ages. So let's just drop it. However, what we can say fairly broadly and consistently about the Middle Ages is that it was an unequal society that was divided into three estates, right? Three classes or estates. The first estate being the clergy, the people of the church. The second estate is the nobility, which is technically the warrior class. And the third estate is everybody else, right? Laborers of all other kinds, who are mostly peasants, right? And this is broadly true. This is basically true of the medieval Latin West. Now, were most people serfs? Well, being a serf is a legal status, right? A serf is a peasant who is tied to the land, who has no right to move, and who is obligated to perform labor for the lord of that land. Okay, serfdom did happen in some places in the Middle Ages, but most peasants were not serfs. Okay, serfdom was not very common. It was not the normal state of affairs for peasants in the Middle Ages. And in fact, peasants in the Middle Ages did have extensive rights and protections under law and custom. And they tended to live a fairly tolerable lifestyle, as I'll talk about more. They were not, sunk into the misery of serfdom. Rather, the heyday of serfdom is, again, the 15, 16, 1700s, specifically in Eastern Europe. So when we're talking about Eastern Germany, Poland, Russia, that's where serfdom was most widespread and most severe. And it was not in the Middle Ages, but rather in the modern era. Okay, serfdom in Russia, for instance, was not abolished until 1861, and serfs there truly had no rights. So serfdom is not an accurate picture of the status or lifestyle of most medieval peasants. Okay, was life boring? And were you doing constant backbreaking work? Well, medieval people, including peasants, observed a very complicated ritual calendar. Not only Sundays, but also all sorts of festivals, holidays, saints' days, extensive long celebrations at Easter time and Christmas time. And when you add up all of these feast days and holidays during which peasants were not expected to work, you actually had about a third of your days off. Okay, so they had more time off than we do. They had more time off than we do. There was more leisure time. There was extensive celebration, and these celebrations not only would involve church worship, but they also would involve revelries, dancing, drinking, and you have a lot of medieval people, especially churchmen, often lamenting, how drunken and disorderly the peasants were, because that's the sort of lifestyle that they actually lived. Now, that's not to say they didn't do very hard work under very harsh conditions. They did, but it was expected that you would also have leisure and you would also have fun. Okay, that was part of the medieval lifestyle. The idea of a farmer or an agricultural laborer going out into the fields and doing backbreaking work basically every day without respite, that's actually a model of life that was created more by the English Puritans, right? The Puritans are the ones who abolished Christmas and abolished all these saints' days and Easter celebrations, and who basically reduced your time off down to just Sundays, right? That's something that early modern Protestants did. It's not something that you saw in the Middle Ages. Was life boring? Well, that's a matter of taste. It's hard to say. But there certainly was music, there was theater, there was storytelling, there was folk art as well as fine art of all sorts. And of course there was creativity. And a lot of that we don't know. Most people in the Middle Ages were illiterate, so we don't have a lot of written records about their poetry, their songs, their folk art. We do know some. For example, there are the Robin Hood stories. The earliest Robin Hood ballad that we have that survives is from about 1400. But we know that those stories went back much farther before then. But it's hard to know a lot about this folk culture and folk art. As for high art, there was of course Gothic architecture and the highly sophisticated styles, as well as engineering and technology that went into building the great Gothic cathedrals. There was vernacular literature, so this is the time when we see the birth of literature in the vernacular languages like Italian, English, French. A lot of these great authors, Dante, Chaucer, Marie de France, are really definitive in shaping these new literary national schools, and there were other forms of art and philosophy. So if you were a more learned person in the upper classes, there was plenty of art and culture to enjoy, and if you were in the lower classes, again, there was plenty of art to enjoy. Did people live short lifespans? It's true that although we can't know with any precision, the average life expectancy probably was somewhere in around 35, somewhere in your 30s through most of the Middle Ages. But this is deceptive. This doesn't mean that a lot of 35-year-olds were dying. Rather, the average is so low because there was so much infant and child mortality, right? It was very common for infants and young children to succumb to diseases that they were being exposed to for the first time, right? Particularly, of course, smallpox. The first time you get smallpox, it's very dangerous. Once you've had it and survived it, then you're resistant to it for the rest of your life, and it's probably never going to affect you again. So what we see is a lot of children die early on in childhood, but then once you get through childhood, once you're a teenager, then you have a pretty good chance of living a long time. So if you were to pick out a medieval person who was 19 or 20 years old, you could reasonably guess that that person is probably going to live to 70, 75. So lifespans were very close to the lifespan we know today if you made it through childhood. Okay. So this problem of infant and child mortality, it really is mostly due to crowd diseases, and it's something that would continue to be a terrible problem really right on up to the 19th century, when you start getting improved sanitation and improved medicine to deal with these problems. And it's really been even more recent, really in the 20th century, that we've come to think of a newborn child as presumably looking forward to a life of 70 or 80 years. Were they sexually prudish? Well, I mentioned there were all those extensive celebrations and revelries in the medieval calendar, and many of them, such as May Day, involved sex. There was plenty of sex. There was plenty of expression of sexuality. These people were not Puritans in the Middle Ages. Puritanism did not exist. You were expected to live a chaste lifestyle if you were a member of the clergy. But for commoners, there was a lot of sexual expression, sexual experimentation. Sometimes royal governments or the church would try to suppress it. Sometimes they would simply tolerate it. There was extensive prostitution, and prostitution was legal in most jurisdictions. Okay, so this is one of the respects in which the Middle Ages actually were more sexually permissive than our own time. Okay? So all of these things I've gone through and explained what was accurate or inaccurate, or partly accurate, at least to the best of my understanding, the best of my knowledge. And one last thing that I skipped over, but that I'm going to point out, I'm going to go back to the idea that the Middle Ages were ignorant. This is a very ironic one, considering that the main centers of learning, research, and teaching in our world today are universities. And universities began in the Middle Ages. All of the sort of great, prestigious old universities in Europe, like Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne, Heidelberg, Bologna, and Padua, Salamanca, all of them were started in the Middle Ages. And this institutional form of having a faculty and a student body and courses that we think of as a college or university, it started from the cathedral schools that clustered around priories attached to cathedrals in Europe. The first example is University of Paris. That was the biggest and most prestigious university in the Middle Ages. It began as simply a gathering of people who wanted to learn from the monks who were attached to Notre Dame in Paris. So the achievements that we think of, that we're most proud of, and that we often think of as the most modern and as the centers of high culture and learning in our modern world, actually have their roots in the Middle Ages. So this is, I think, a good point to point out last, because it's such a crowning irony of the way we talk about the Middle Ages and the way we sort of sniff and sneer and hold ourselves as so superior to the medieval world and medieval people. Now, before I end this particular lecture and get into later lectures into the details of what the Middle Ages were and how they worked, I'm going to bring up the question again: why do we talk about the Middle Ages as a coherent period of time? And why do we see them in this very dim light? People in the Middle Ages didn't walk around saying, we're living in the Middle Ages. At least very few of them did. Most people, whether they were learned or not, didn't think of themselves as living in the Middle Ages. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense, right? We don't talk about ourselves today living in the middle period. And people back in these centuries didn't either. So where did this notion come from, that there's this block of time that we can separate out roughly from the fall of the Western Empire until the Renaissance, that we can call the Middle Ages. Most people in these centuries believed that they were living in the last age, or the final age. They were living in the Christian era, and they believed that was the last age of humankind. So for them, when they looked back at history, they separated time into periods based on great cosmic events, right? Events in which divine providence reshaped the world, mainly biblical events, okay? The creation, the fall of man, the flood, the Exodus, right? They use these cosmic events to separate history into epochs. And from their point of view, they were living in the last epoch. So the death and resurrection of Christ inaugurated the Christian era. And they believed that this Christian era would continue until the second coming of Christ. And that would then usher in Judgment Day and the final end of history. Okay? So this phrase, the end of history, should should maybe bring up some associations for some of you. People always tend to think that they're living close to or at the end of history. And that's what medieval people thought. They thought they were in the final age, which was the Christian age. They didn't say we're living in the Middle Age. However, there was a small minority of people, a small fringe school of thought that emerged in the High and Late Middle Ages, who did walk around saying we're in the Middle Age. Okay, so there were some people who did think and talk this way, and they started with a mystical, apocalyptic preacher in Italy named Joachim of Fiore. And Joachim of Fiore put forward a sort of grand cosmic scheme of human life that changed and replaced the old way of separating time into epochs. He argued that, in fact, there were 3 ages. Okay, this should sound familiar. There were 3 ages. There was the first age, that was the age of the Old Covenant or the Old Testament, which ended with Christ. Christ had ushered in the Middle Age. And then the second coming of Christ would not immediately end history, but rather it would begin a future age, a third age, a millennium of peace. And he named these 3 ages by the 3 persons of the Trinity. So the early age, the age of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, he called the age of the Father, right? It was the age of law. Then the Christian age was the age of the Son. Straightforward enough. Christ is the Son in the Trinity. And then the millennium of peace that was to follow was the age of the Spirit, in which people would have direct communion with God, and freedom would rule. So it was the age of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and he believed that he was living in the Middle Age, the age of the Son, which would soon end and be replaced by the millennium of peace. And this was a kind of edgy and unusual notion that the church was not entirely comfortable with, but for several hundred years they didn't formally condemn it either. And it actually gathered a certain number of followers around Europe, mainly learned people, some of them clergy, and most of all in Italy. There were so-called Joachimites, people who subscribed to this apocalyptic notion of history. So this was a school of thought that was, it was apocalyptic, but it was optimistic. Most apocalypticists actually tend to be optimistic. They tend to be looking forward towards some kind of savior or some kind of transformation that will bring about, peace, harmony, happiness. This is what most apocalypticists tend to imagine. So these Joachimites are a kind of fringe school of thought, particularly common in Italy, And they tend to be underground because their ideas are not totally popular, and they're not embraced by the church, certainly, although they aren't necessarily explicitly condemned either. So this is the first time that we see someone putting forward this idea that history fits into 3 ages, 3 eras. The same sort of notion, this tripartite model of history, gets taken up again in the 1400s, specifically in Florence, among Florentine humanists, people that we today would call Renaissance humanists. They also divide history into these 3 parts. And particularly a certain historian, Leonardo Bruni, writes a history of the Florentine people, and he separates it into ancient, medieval, the middle, and modern. Now, he switches the criteria a bit. So rather than saying the transition from the first age to the second age is Christ, rather he says the transition from the first age to the second age is the fall of the Roman Empire. And that's the way he talked about it, because he was a Westerner and he didn't really care about the Eastern Empire. So he said, okay, the ancient world ended, and ancient Florence ended with the fall of the Roman Empire. Then we've had this middle era, but now we today are standing at the cusp of the modern era. And we are standing at the cusp of the modern era because we are reaching back and reviving the wisdom and greatness of the ancients, right? So the 3 eras are a cycle, right? There's the efflorescence, the brilliance of the ancient world. There's the sinking into darkness of the medieval world. And then there is the rise back into light and back into greatness of the final age, the modern age. So basically, these humanists like Leonardo Bruni are taking up Joachim of Fiore's model of separating history. He's just changing the markers. They're no longer cosmic events or events of divine providence. They're human events, right? And what leads into the second age is human ignorance and human violence and barbarity, which human beings now must redeem themselves from through study, wisdom, enlightenment, recovery of the ancient. And the savior now that's going to lead the world out of the darkness of the second age into the third and final age, the age of peace and of freedom, is not Christ, but rather it's human beings. It's Florentine scholars like Bruni himself. So this idea that we are modern and that the moderns are recovering the ancient, that this is a rebirth, a renaissance of the ancient, it's basically the second coming of Christ, just revised a bit so that instead of Christ descending from the clouds, it's instead humanist scholars who are redeeming humankind from their fallenness and from the darkness of the Middle Era. So what I'm trying to show here is not exactly that the Middle Ages never happened, but it's that there's an agenda behind separating history out in this way, and that this way of portraying history, ancient, medieval, modern, really caught on among scholars and has persisted, I think, mainly because it's very flattering to scholars. It places scholars in this sort of savior, redeemer role as the people who will bring history into its greatest and last age. And I think it's no accident that as the modern world has carried on, we often see scholars, philosophers, writers, again, over and over invoking this idea that they are going to bring about the final age of history. They are going to bring about, in a sense, the millennium, as Joachim of Fiore would have called it. So what we need to do is we need to understand both what is valuable and useful and enlightening about this model of history that says there was an age from the fall of the Western Empire until the so-called Renaissance. We need to understand what that age was and how it really worked, and in doing so, we also need to see what is distorting, right? And we need to get past this need for self-flattering myths and myths that idealize our own time as simply the obviously superior fulfillment of processes from the past. It's not that simple. So what I'm going to do is in some more lectures, I'm going to examine and try to explain how the Middle Ages really worked. And I'm going to, on the one hand, try to be impartial and present a reasonably accurate picture of the medieval era in all its complexity, in all its different periods, in all its different meanings. And maybe at the end, we'll end up reaffirming some of the same ideas, some of the same myths that we started out with. Maybe we'll end up with different myths, or maybe we'll just end up with confusion. And I think any of those results are fine. As I have often said to students when I bring up subjects like the Bible or the medieval church or the Enlightenment, I say, I want you to come out of this more confused than when you came in. And maybe that's what will end up happening, at least for a lot of us. But at least it will be a better informed and more clear-headed confusion than the mythology that we came in with. So that'll be it for today. And in upcoming lectures, I'm going to talk about what life was like and how it worked in the Latin West during that era when the Eastern Roman Empire continued to rule, but the Western Roman Empire was gone. And if you like these lectures, please go to my Patreon page, which is under the same title, Historiansplaining, and consider giving some support. I've got to pay the electric bill. Thanks.